22 years of marriage, and the clearest thing my wife ever said to me arrived on a Monday morning in a sealed envelope delivered by a man in a suit who couldn't make eye contact. My name is Charles Grant. I'm 64 years old. I was born in Savannah, Georgia, grew up on the east side of town near the Savannah River, and I have spent the better part of 4 decades buying, developing, and managing commercial real estate across the Lowcountry and the Georgia coast. I am not a flashy man. I drive a 10-year-old Ford pickup that my daughter calls embarrassing. I wear the same Carhartt jacket from November to March. I drink my coffee black. I pay my property taxes early. And until the Monday morning of September 9th, 2024, I thought I had a reasonably honest marriage. I was wrong about that last one. The envelope landed on the kitchen island at 7:45 in the morning. I was standing at the counter eating a bowl of oatmeal and reading through a lease renewal for a warehouse property we manage in the Savannah Port District. The man who delivered it, one of those private process servers who looks uncomfortable in his own skin, handed it over with the hurried apology of someone who has done this 100 times and still hasn't gotten used to it. Renee was already gone. She had left the house at 7, earlier than usual, and I noticed now in retrospect that she had taken her overnight bag. She had not kissed me goodbye. She had not said anything at all, actually. She had just moved through the kitchen in a cloud of expensive perfume and left through the side door while I was in the shower. That should have told me something. I set down my spoon. I opened the envelope. The cover page read, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage. Renee Lynn Grant, Petitioner, v. Charles Edward Grant, Respondent. Filed in Chatham County Superior Court, State of Georgia. Date of filing, September 6, 2024. She had filed it on a Friday. Quietly. Without a word. And then come home for the weekend, slept in our bed, eaten dinner across the table from me on Saturday night, and said nothing. I want you to hold that image for a moment, because it tells you everything you need to know about who Renee had become. I read through the petition with the same methodical calm I use when I'm reviewing a title insurance report on a troubled property. There was no point in panicking. Panic is expensive. Panic makes you say things your attorney has to spend the next 6 months apologizing for. The demands were itemized in an attachment labeled Proposed Equitable Distribution of Marital Assets. I'll give you the highlights. The house on Habersham Street, a 5-bedroom historic property in the Ardsley Park neighborhood of Savannah that we purchased in 2011 for $820,000 and that was currently worth somewhere north of $1.4 million. Renee wanted it. Sole title. The cars, a 2022 Mercedes GLE that she drove, and a 2020 Land Rover Defender that I drove. She wanted both, on the grounds that she required reliable transportation and that my pickup truck was an adequate alternative. The joint investment accounts. There were 2. One with a balance of approximately $180,000 that we had funded jointly over the years for household and vacation expenses, and one, or so she believed, that held a much more substantial sum representing the accumulated value of my business interests. And then the main event, 50% of Grant Commercial Properties LLC, the business I had built from a single leased warehouse unit in 1991, the company that currently managed 14 commercial properties across Chatham and Bryan counties, the entity that, in Renee's understanding, was worth somewhere in the range of $6 to $8 million. There was one final line in the attachment, a single sentence under the heading, Minor and Dependent Children. It read, "The party's daughter, Maya Grant, age 21, is an adult and therefore no custody arrangement is sought or required." No mention of Maya beyond that. No reference to college support. No request for any continued financial provision for her daughter. Renee had drawn a clean line around the assets she wanted and excluded the only human being she had been responsible for raising. I set the petition down on the kitchen counter. I looked out the window at the live oaks in our front yard, the Spanish moss hanging still in the September morning air. And then I picked up the phone and called my attorney. His name is Phil Tanner. He's been my attorney for 19 years. A quiet, wire-framed man in his late 50s who runs a corporate and real estate law practice out of a converted townhouse on Bull Street in downtown Savannah. Phil has negotiated deals that most people in this city will never know about. He is not dramatic. He does not raise his voice. He is, in my estimation, the most dangerous person in any room he occupies, precisely because nobody ever sees him coming. He picked up on the first ring. He already knew. I got a call from opposing counsel Friday afternoon, Phil said. I was going to reach out today. Are you sitting down? I'm standing in my kitchen eating cold oatmeal. Sit down anyway. A pause. Renee's attorney is a man named Dennis Fogarty. He's family law, aggressive, good track record in Chatham County. He's going to push hard on the business valuation. Let him push. I meant it. Another pause. Longer this time. Charles. I know, Phil. You want to tell me what you want to do here before I start working? I looked at the petition again. I looked at the line about Maya. Give her everything she asked for. Phil went quiet for a full 3 seconds, which for Phil is the equivalent of another man dropping his coffee and saying, "What in the world are you talking about?" Charles. I mean it. Call Fogarty. Tell him we're not contesting. Tell him we'll agree to the full proposed distribution. The house, the cars, the accounts, all of it. You understand what you're giving away. I understand exactly what I'm giving away. I held his eyes. Which is why I'm the one giving it. There was a long silence on the line. Then Phil let out a breath that was about 40% relief and 60% the quiet satisfaction of a man who already knows the ending of a story nobody else has read yet. I'll call him this afternoon, Phil said. One more thing, I added. Make sure Fogarty knows we want the hearing scheduled as soon as possible. No delays on our end. We're ready to close this out. I could hear Phil almost smile. I'll convey that. I hung up. I put the petition back in the envelope. I finished my oatmeal, cold as it was, and drove to the office. Here's something I want you to understand about the kind of man I am, because it matters for everything that follows. I grew up in the East Savannah of the 1970s, in a neighborhood that has since been gentrified beyond recognition. My father, Roy Grant, worked the overnight shift at the Georgia Ports Authority for 31 years. My mother, Elaine, cleaned houses 5 days a week and made the best cornbread in Chatham County. We were not poor, exactly. We were careful. The difference, as my father explained it, was this. Poor people spend what they have. Careful people know where every dollar is before they spend a single one. I built Grant Commercial Properties on that principle. Every acquisition documented, every lease structured, every entity organized the way a surgeon organizes an instrument tray. Nothing out of place, nothing unaccounted for. In October 2022, 2 full years before Renee walked into a lawyer's office, I had restructured my business entirely. There was nothing dramatic about it. There was no fight, no crisis, no sudden revelation. There was just a conversation I had with Phil after completing our company's annual financial review, during which I looked at the numbers and thought very calmly, if something happens to me, this needs to be organized. If something happens to this marriage, this needs to be protected. I was 62 years old. I had a 21-year-old business, and I had a daughter, Maya, then 19, a sophomore at the Savannah College of Art and Design, who I had decided, a long time before that October, was going to be the person I built this for. What I did was entirely legal, thoroughly documented, and invisible to anyone who didn't already know. Grant Commercial Properties LLC was formally dissolved in October 2022. All assets, the 14 properties, the management contracts, the equipment, the operating reserves, were transferred into the Charles E. Grant Irrevocable Family Trust. The trust had 2 named beneficiaries, Maya Christine Grant, primary, and a charitable remainder designated to the Historic Savannah Foundation, secondary. The trustee was Phil Tanner. The marital home on Habersham Street, the house Renee had demanded in her petition, had been leased to Charles and Renee Grant by the trust since November 2022, under a formal lease agreement at fair market rate, which we paid monthly from the joint household account. In the eyes of Georgia law and the Chatham County property records, the house was trust property. It was not a marital asset. The 2 cars were also trust assets, leased to us personally. The joint account Renee expected to be the tip of a very large iceberg. It was all that existed outside the trust. $182,000, 22 years of shared expenses and weekend trips, and the occasional extravagance. That was the marital estate, under Georgia law, specifically under OCGA Section 1939 and the case law governing equitable division. Property held in an irrevocable trust, established before the initiation of divorce proceedings, is separate property, not subject to equitable distribution, provided the trust was not created with fraudulent intent to defeat a spouse's interests. Phil had that documentation airtight. The trust predated the divorce filing by nearly 2 years. The business rationale, estate planning, succession structure, charitable intent, was explicit and documented. Renee's attorney had filed a demand for 50% of Grant Commercial Properties LLC. Grant Commercial Properties LLC had not existed since October 2022. I didn't know yet exactly when Dennis Fogarty would figure that out, but I knew precisely where he would be sitting when he did. I need to tell you about the moment Renee left, because I haven't told you the worst part yet. On the Thursday evening after I received the petition, 4 days after she filed, Renee came back to the house to collect some things. She had been staying, I'd learned from a mutual friend, in a rented corporate suite at the Bohemian Hotel on River Street, which runs about $380 a night, and which she was paying for, I noted dryly, out of the joint account I'd agreed to let sit untouched until the hearing. Maya had driven down from her apartment near SCAD that afternoon. She hadn't told me she was coming. She just appeared at the kitchen door around 3 o'clock, dropped her bag on the floor, and stood there for a moment with the particular expression of a 21-year-old who is trying very hard to look more composed than she feels. "Is it true?" she asked. "Which part? That you're just agreeing to everything, that you're not fighting it?" "That's true." No elaboration needed. She sat down at the kitchen table. I poured her a glass of sweet tea. It was a warm September afternoon, and I sat across from her and waited, because Maya has always been a person who needs a moment before she says the real thing. "She didn't ask for anything from me," Maya said finally. Her voice was quiet and careful, the way it gets when she's trying not to let emotion drive. "Not college support, not anything. She just wrote me off as an adult and moved on." "I know. Does that not—" She stopped, looked at her glass. "Does that not bother you?" I want to be honest about what I felt at that moment. Anger, yes. Not the explosive kind. The deep, cold, structural kind that doesn't show on your face. The kind that doesn't need a scene because it's already decided what it's going to do. I had built 21 years of my working life around the belief that I was protecting this girl's future, and her mother had reduced her to a footnote in a legal document. It bothers me. I looked at her evenly. It also tells me everything I need to know. Maya looked at me steadily. "You have a plan." I didn't answer that directly. "Here's what I need you to do." I leaned forward. "Go back to school. Finish your semester. Don't call her. Don't argue. Don't post anything. Just keep your head down and do your work." She studied me for a long moment with the sharp-eyed patience she's had since she was about 7. Then she nodded once, picked up her glass, and changed the subject. That was Thursday. Renee came by at 6 that evening, moving through the house with the brisk efficiency of someone who has already mentally redecorated. She collected clothes, jewelry, a set of framed prints from the upstairs hallway, and a cashmere throw from the living room. She moved through the spaces we had shared for 13 years with the detached focus of a woman packing for a long trip. She passed Maya in the hallway without stopping. "You look tired." She glanced at our daughter. "Get more sleep." And she was gone. Maya and I ate dinner that night in the kitchen. Leftover chicken and rice. Nothing fancy. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. I didn't know it yet, but that would be the last civil evening before the hearing, and the last time Renee Grant would set foot in that house as anything other than a tenant. October in Savannah is the month when the city finally exhales. The brutal Georgia summer releases its grip sometime around the first week of October, and the air that replaces it is clean and cool, carrying that particular low-country smell of salt marsh and live oak that you either love completely or never quite understand. The squares fill up again. People eat outside. The city remembers it's beautiful. I spent most of October 2024 doing ordinary things with extraordinary deliberateness. I went to the office on East Bay Street every morning. I reviewed leases and property reports and tenant correspondence. I had lunch at a diner on Drayton Street that I've eaten at since 1993. Always the same corner booth, always the same turkey melt. I called Maya every Sunday evening. I went to bed at 10 and slept without difficulty, which surprised even me. What I did not do was communicate with Renee directly. Phil and Dennis Fogarty handled the procedural exchanges, and there were several of them. Fogarty's office sent interrogatories requesting financial disclosure. Phil provided the documents. All of them. Every tax return, every account statement, every property record. Everything was accurate, Everything was current, and everything pointed in the same direction. The marital estate consisted of the joint account, the joint use of the vehicles, and equitable entitlement to a portion of my salary income as distributed from the trust. Fogarty sent a follow-up request specifically asking for the corporate records and asset schedule of Grant Commercial Properties LLC. Phil sent him the dissolution paperwork. Dated October 14, 2022. I would have paid money to hear that phone call between Fogarty and Renee. What I know is that Renee called me directly on October 8th, 18 days before the hearing, for the first time since she had moved out. I was in my truck, driving back from a property inspection in the Pooler area west of Savannah, and her name appeared on the screen with the particular jarring quality of something unexpected in a predictable day. I answered. Charles. Her voice had a new edge in it, still composed, still controlled, but underneath it the faint vibration of a person recalibrating. Renee. I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be straight with me. I'm always straight with you. A pause. What happened to the company? It was restructured. I kept my voice even. 2 years ago. Phil can walk your attorney through the details. Restructured into what? A trust. A silence that lasted about 4 seconds. I watched the marsh grass along I-16 passing outside my window, flat and gold in the October afternoon light. When did you do this? Her voice was careful now, deliberate. She was running numbers in her head and they weren't adding up. October 2022. A pause. It's all in the disclosures, Renee. Everything's documented. Is this? Another pause. Is this because of me? That's an interesting question to ask a man you filed divorce papers on. It's because I'm 62 years old and I needed an estate plan. I watched the marsh grass. At least that's what the paperwork says. The silence that followed had a different quality, denser, with something working behind it. I want to talk about this before the hearing. Her voice had gone careful. Talk to Phil. I let the silence hold for one beat. That's what he's there for. And I ended the call. I pulled into the office parking lot. I sat in the truck for a moment with the engine running. She had figured out the shape of it. She hadn't figured out the depth. Renee's next move, which Phil told me about on October 14th, was to request a continuance, a delay in the hearing to allow her legal team more time to review the trust documentation. Fogarty argued that the complexity of the disclosed financial structure warranted additional preparation time. Phil's response was polite, brief, and immovable. His client had agreed to the full proposed distribution from the original petition. His client had provided complete financial disclosure as required. His client saw no basis for delay and wished to proceed to the scheduled hearing on October 23rd. The judge denied the continuance. I want you to understand why I didn't delay things and why I didn't give Renee time to regroup. Not out of cruelty, I want to be honest about that, but out of simple logic. A trap doesn't work if you give the other party time to find the exit. Renee had filed those papers. Renee had drawn up that demand list. Renee had made the calculation that a 64-year-old man with a company and a house and 22 years of shared life would choose to protect his assets by fighting, and that she could extract maximum value in the fight. She never considered that I might simply agree, and that agreeing might be the mechanism of her defeat. There's a negotiation principle I learned from my father, though he'd never have called it that. He just called it knowing what you own before you sit down. He said it about poker and about buying a used car and about everything else. If you know what you own, you don't have to bluff. You don't have to raise your voice. You can sit quietly with your hand face down and let the other person bet everything on a pot that isn't there. I had known what I owned for 2 years. During the week before the hearing, I moved out of the Habersham Street house. Not dramatically. I didn't load a moving truck or make a production of it. I took my clothes, my books, my father's old pocket watch, the framed photographs from my home office, and a cast-iron skillet that had been my mother's. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in the historic district on Jones Street, a comfortable, well-maintained space on the ground floor of a converted antebellum row house with 12-foot ceilings and a small courtyard in the back. I liked it immediately. It had the clean simplicity of a place that belongs to only you. Phil had served formal notice on Renee that the trust-owned property, the house and both vehicles, was subject to trust terms and not transferable to her personally as a marital asset. Fogarty had formally objected. That objection would be heard at the October 23rd proceeding. On the evening of October 22nd, The night before the hearing, Maya drove down from Savannah again. She showed up at my Jones Street apartment at 7:30 with a bag of takeout from a Caribbean restaurant on MLK Jr. Boulevard that we'd been eating at together since she was a teenager. Jerk chicken, rice and peas, fried plantains. We ate at the small table by the courtyard window. The night was cool, the courtyard quiet, the sound of the city muffled and distant. "Are you nervous?" she asked, picking at her rice. "No." And I meant it. She set her fork down and looked at me directly. I looked up the trust documents. "The ones Phil filed. I'm the primary beneficiary." "Yes." "You did that in 2022. "Yes." "Before she filed." 2 years before. Maya was quiet for a moment. The courtyard light caught the angles of her face. She has her grandmother's cheekbones, sharp and precise, and she looked at me with an expression I recognized because I've worn it myself. The look of a person who has just understood something they should have seen earlier. "You saw this coming." Not an accusation, just a statement. I thought about how to answer that honestly. I saw a pattern. I set my fork down, and I made a decision. The decision wasn't about your mother. It was about you. It was about making sure that 21 years of building something didn't disappear into a proceeding because I hadn't organized my affairs properly. She nodded slowly. "Then, what happens tomorrow?" "Fogarty presents the demand list. Phil presents the disclosed assets. The judge reviews what's actually in the marital estate. And everyone in that room discovers that the list and the assets don't match the way Renee expected them to. And then, Renee's attorney has a very difficult conversation with his client about the difference between what she asked for and what Georgia law actually allows her to have." Maya picked up her fork again. She speared a piece of plantain. "Is she going to be okay?" she asked quietly. "Like, financially, is she going to be in trouble?" I thought about that question with more care than Renee had ever applied to the equivalent question about Maya. "She'll be fine." I counted it out for her. She gets the joint account. She gets her personal property. She gets equitable distribution of income. She's not walking out destitute, Maya. She just isn't walking out with my life's work. Maya nodded. She ate. After a moment she looked up again. "Why did you build it for me? You could have just spent it. You could have just let it be the marital estate and fought her for your half." I put my fork down. "Because your grandfather spent 31 years loading cargo at the port so that your father could have something to build with. And I spent 33 years building it. The purpose of that, the whole point, was never to accumulate. It was to pass something forward. To give you a foundation that nobody can take out from under you." I looked at her steadily. "Your mother wrote you out of that demand list like you were a line item. I'm not going to let the thing I built for you disappear because of someone else's greed." Maya didn't say anything for a while. She looked at her plate. Then she looked out at the courtyard. Then she looked back at me. "Okay." She looked at her plate. Then at me. "Okay." We finished dinner. We watched an old movie on the small television in the living room. She fell asleep on the couch around 10 o'clock, and I covered her with a blanket and went to bed. I slept 8 hours without interruption. The Chatham County Courthouse sits on Montgomery Street in downtown Savannah. A heavy, deliberate building of Georgia marble and columns that has the permanent expression of something that has outlasted every drama ever brought before it and expects to outlast several more. I arrived at 8:45 on the morning of Wednesday, October 23, 2024. The air was 58 degrees and dry, the kind of October morning that makes Savannah feel like the best version of itself. I wore a navy suit, a white shirt, no tie. Phil was waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom with his briefcase and 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one without commentary, which is one of the many reasons I've kept him employed for 19 years. "Ready?" Phil tilted his head. "Been ready for 2 years." We went in. Renee arrived at 9:05 with Dennis Fogarty and a paralegal carrying 2 banker's boxes of documents, which told me that Fogarty had spent the last 2 weeks doing a great deal of work that was not going to produce the outcome he'd expected. Renee was dressed in a charcoal blazer and had the composed, forward-facing expression of a woman who has decided on confidence as her presentation strategy. She sat across the aisle and didn't look at me. Fogarty opened by reiterating the petition's demands in full: house, cars, accounts, and 50% of Grant Commercial Properties LLC, and argued that the trust restructuring should be examined by the court as a potentially fraudulent conveyance executed with the intent to defeat spousal property rights. Phil's response was measured and surgical. He walked the court through the trust documentation, the dissolution records of the LLC, and the timeline. October 2022 restructuring. No divorce proceedings until September 2024. A 23-month gap between the trust's establishment and the filing of the petition. A documented estate planning rationale. A clearly established pattern of annual estate review that predated the trust. The charitable remainder component. The independence of the trustee. "There is no evidence," Phil said, with the quiet authority of a man who does not need to raise his voice because the documents are doing it for him, "that the trust was established in contemplation of divorce. It was established in contemplation of a 62-year-old man's mortality and his obligations to his daughter. That is not a fraudulent conveyance. That is estate planning." The judge, a woman in her late 50s named Patricia Holbrook, who had the practiced patience of someone who has heard every version of every argument in this building, reviewed the filings without expression. Fogarty requested a recess. The judge granted 15 minutes. I watched Fogarty pull Renee into the hallway through the heavy courtroom door. Through the narrow vertical window beside it, I could see the paralegal spreading documents on a bench. The LLC dissolution, the trust registration, the property lease agreements showing the house as a trust asset. I watched Fogarty point at a page. I watched Renee read it. "Here's the thing about a well-built trap. You don't spring it dramatically. You just let it close at its own speed." I sipped my coffee. Phil sat beside me writing notes on a legal pad with his small, precise handwriting. 7 minutes into the recess, the door opened. Fogarty came back in first. He had the controlled expression of an experienced attorney absorbing a setback. Which is to say, his face was entirely still and his jaw was fractionally tighter than it had been before. Renee came in behind him. She sat down. A moment later, Fogarty leaned over and spoke to her in a voice too low to carry across the courtroom. But in the particular silence of a room where the air conditioning is the loudest thing present, the words carried just far enough. 5 words. Quiet. Precise. Irrevocable. The LLC no longer exists. I did not look at Renee directly, but I did not need to. I watched her reflection in the polished surface of the wood paneling on the wall behind the judge's bench. I watched her absorb it. I watched her sit completely still for 3 full seconds. I watched her put her hand flat on the table, very slowly, the way a person steadies themselves when the floor has moved. That was the moment. Not a dramatic scene. Not a confrontation. Not a victory speech. Just a woman discovering, in a county courthouse in Savannah, Georgia, on a cool October morning, that the empire she had calculated on inheriting had been reorganized 2 years before she'd asked for it, and that the only person who had been protected all along was the daughter she'd written out of the petition like a footnote. The judge returned. The proceeding resumed. The court's findings were consistent with Phil's argument. The trust assets were not subject to equitable division. The marital estate consisted of the joint account balance of $182,000, divided equally between the parties. Each party retained their personal property. Charles Grant's salary income as distributed from the trust would be factored into an equitable support calculation, resulting in a transitional support payment to Renee of $3,200 per month for 24 months, a provision Phil had already anticipated and planned for. Fogarty formally withdrew the fraudulent conveyance argument. He had nothing to support it and he knew it. The dissolution was granted. The whole proceeding from opening statements to gavel took 47 minutes to gavel took 47 minutes. I signed the papers at the clerk's table at 10:58 a.m. Phil shook my hand without ceremony and collected his briefcase. I walked out of the Chatham County Courthouse and stood for a moment on the Montgomery Street steps in the October air. The city spread out quiet and ordinary around me, the live oaks on the square across the street dropping their moss in the light breeze. My father would have nodded once and gone back to work. I got in my truck and drove to the office. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Maya that evening, because it's the part of this story that actually matters. She was back in Savannah. She'd driven down again, unable to stay away, which I understand completely, and she was sitting on the steps of my Jones Street apartment when I pulled up at 6 o'clock. She stood up when she saw me. She looked at my face for 1 second and then she said simply, "Done? Done." We went inside. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table and I told her what had happened, plainly and in order, without dramatizing it. She listened without interrupting, which is one of her best qualities. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. What does she get? Maya asked. Half the joint account, about $91,000. Transitional support for 2 years. Her personal belongings. And the house? The house belongs to the trust, which means it belongs to you eventually. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. I don't know how to feel about that. She turned the cup in her hands. About the house. I grew up there. You don't have to feel any particular way about it. You don't have to live there. You don't have to sell it. You don't have to do anything with it until you're ready, and you have time. That's the whole point. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. In 2022, when you set it up. Why didn't you say anything? I thought about that. Because I hoped I was being overly cautious. I hoped you'd never need to know. I hoped your mother would be the person I thought she was for the first 10 years of our marriage. When you build a structure, in real estate, in law, in anything, you build it for the worst case. You build it hoping the worst case never comes. You don't announce the fire escape to your dinner guests. Maya almost smiled at that. Almost. She really didn't ask for anything from me. It wasn't a question. She already knew. But sometimes a person needs to say a true thing out loud before they can finish processing it. No, I held that. She didn't. Silence. The courtyard outside the window had gone dark, a single lamp casting a yellow circle on the brick. That's the part I can't get past, Maya said quietly. Not the money, not the house, just, she filed that petition and wrote me off in one sentence. And that was on purpose. That was a choice. It was. And she's my mother. She is. How do you? She stopped, restarted. How do you not hate her for that? I set my coffee down. Because hating her requires that I keep lending her space in my head, and she's already had more than she deserved. What she did tells me who she is. It doesn't change who you are. It doesn't change what I built for you. The only thing it changes is the amount of energy I'm willing to spend on her going forward, which is none. Maya looked at her hands. Then she looked up. Okay. For the second time in 2 days, that same word, with a different weight behind it. More settled, more finished. I refilled her coffee. We talked about other things, her thesis project at SCAD, a textile design series she'd been working on for 3 months, her plans for after graduation. We talked about the historic Savannah Foundation work the trust would fund, and whether she wanted any involvement in it. We talked about what she wanted to do with the house eventually, without any urgency, just as a conversation. We stayed at the table until 9:30, long past when either of us needed to be anywhere, just talking. The apartment was quiet and well lit, and exactly the right size for one person and one evening with their daughter. I thought about my father, Roy Grant, coming home from the port at 6 in the morning, in his faded work jacket, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee before the house woke up. I thought about what he had passed to me and what I was passing forward. The last thing I want to say is this, because this channel tells stories for a reason, and the reason isn't just the drama, though the drama is real. I am 64 years old. I have been in business for 33 years. I have bought and sold and managed and developed more property than I can easily count. And the most important thing I have ever learned, more important than any lease structure, any title search, any zoning variance, is this. Know what you own before you sit down. Not just financially. Know what you have built and for whom. Know who the people in your life are, and whether their interests align with yours. Know the difference between a partner and a person who is positioned near your assets. Know when you are being mistaken for your net worth. And when you have built something real, something that took decades and discipline and the kind of early mornings that nobody else sees. Organize it. Document it. Put it in a structure that will survive whatever comes. Not because you expect betrayal, because you respect what you built enough to protect it. My wife wanted the house, the cars, the accounts, and half of a company that hadn't existed for 2 years. She got a fair settlement and a lesson in due diligence. My daughter got the foundation her grandfather started, and her father spent his life building. I got a 2-bedroom apartment on Jones Street with 12-foot ceilings, a courtyard, and the uninterrupted sleep of a man who did exactly what he set out to do. Some people would call that a loss. I call it the best deal I ever closed. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more family-centered accounts like this.